Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this appropriately zombie-themed October lecture in this Methods of Inquiry class. In case you've forgotten my face, my name is Professor Platek, and I am the English portion of our three-person teaching team. So before we get started, I want to give you guys just a couple of bookkeeping reminders. So first off, please remember that this Friday, October 16th, you do not have class, or discussion section, pardon me, because it is fall break. So secondly, please remember that your next presentation assignment is due the week of Halloween, and that's going to be October 30th. And then finally, just a brief note about how this lecture is going to run. It occurs in two parts. I'll do part one, and then there'll be a break, and you can finish the part one video, go take a break, get a drink, have a snack, and then come back for part two. There is also a lecture guide that goes with this lecture, and some of the questions that you'll be asked to answer on the quiz actually ask you to go to the links provided in the lecture guide. So please have that open alongside you as I move through this lecture. Okay, so let's get started, and happy couple of weeks until Halloween. I'm wearing the most Halloween-y getup I can, which is the only black stuff that I own. So again, hello and welcome to the second of your 3 English weeks in this Methods of Inquiry class. Last time we met, we talked about figurative language, how sometimes very small shifts in word use can have significant effects in shaping our behavior. Today we're going to talk about an even bigger unit of language, story. So let's get started. So why do stories matter to healthcare? In addition to studying figurative language, English also studies representation at the level of story. The stories that we tell as a culture and as individuals follow particular formats, and those formats shape our expectations. And those expectations shape not only the stories that we expect to read, encounter, and watch in fiction, but the stories that we expect from real life. And this is especially important in healthcare situations. So why is that? Well, we're part of a culture that has a whole lot of preset stories about what health and well-being and illness should look like. These stories shape our definitions of health and well-being, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad ways. Every time we try to tell a story about what we're feeling, we're also communicating with a huge field of pre-existing stories. That makes things rather complicated. So while it might seem counterintuitive to think of healthcare as a question of narrative, of story, just consider a usual visit to a doctor. It has a plot, in other words, a sequence of events that are supposed to happen in a particular order. So, and you guys are all familiar with this, right? You know that a normal plot of a doctor's visit goes something like this. You check in, you see the nurse, you get weighed and measured, the doctor comes in, you describe the problem, the doctor examines you, the doctor diagnoses you, the doctor gives you medicine and or advice. This is the basic plot of the doctor's visit. When medical appointments don't go this way, we actually feel uncomfortable or anxious because we know probably something is wrong. This is because common plots shape our expectations for our own lives, and more on why this matters later. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 1. And as always, you guys are going to be looking at my little face in the left-hand corner of the screen if you get bored looking at the slides, and you'll see me turning through the old school hard copy version of my lecture notes. Okay, so indeed, our culture tends to think not only of health and well-being as things that have plots, but of illnesses themselves as things that have basic plots. The kind of typical story that our culture tells about an illness is this one. You get sick, you get diagnosed, and you either get better or you don't. Our culture tends to see illness either as a comedy, one that ends happily with cure, or a tragedy, one that ends unhappily with death. And that sounds pretty standard, right? Actually wrong. What's interesting about the plot sequence that I've just given you is that it is neither universal nor even comparatively old historically. That plot is historically and culturally contingent. So before modern medicine, i.e. in the early 20th century, there were very few available cures that work in the way we tend to think of cures working, quickly and definitively. The classic cure is a serum or an antibiotic, a prescription that you can give to someone that clearly gets rid of their illness. We only gained this type of cure, however, at the very beginning of the 20th century, when they were discovered to pretty massive acclaim. So think of a world in which you have penicillin antibiotics for the first time. This was a watershed moment in medical history. Polio vaccines, same way. Nobody knew that you could get rid of, at such a large scale, a disease like polio before. So these sorts of instant or surefire cures fundamentally changed the way that we as a culture tell stories about illness. Before the 20th century, it was much more common to have lingering, chronic, or lifelong illnesses, and the stories about those illnesses had much more complex plots. A classic example is tuberculosis, the characteristic illness seen in Anglophone, that means English speaking, 19th and early 20th century literature and art. Tuberculosis could linger for literally decades. It could go into remission, it could come back, it could not come back, etc. It was sometimes a death sentence, but sometimes it wasn't. However, because we now live in the era of modern medicine and have been taught that the basic plot of an illness ends in either cure or death, we often have trouble, and this includes doctors too, treating and thinking about chronic or lingering illnesses. And one way to think about this is to think about the way that we talk about the COVID vaccine. How often have you heard people talk about COVID as something that will last only until we have a vaccine, as if the vaccine will magically make the virus disappear? It won't. It won't even get close to doing that. It's much more likely, actually, that we'll be living with some version of COVID for a really long time, and our society is going to have to change to accommodate it. Um, but we think of it, the vaccine, as the surefire cure because that's what the narratives of modern medicine have taught us to understand about the relationship between medicine and disease. So, more generally, however, we're also hyper focused on the idea of cure, which isn't necessarily the only or best way to think about illness. And this has major real world effects. For example, medical scientists, in order to get grant money, often have to make promises about the curative properties of the drugs they're testing. This can lead in several directions, none of them great for actual medical science. Sometimes scientists will stick to very safe experiments, things they basically know will show some sort of improvement, even if it's minor, because their funding depends on being able to claim that their drugs work. Sometimes they'll just make exaggerated promises about the potential of their experiments. When that potential isn't borne out, they either lose funding or, if they're especially unscrupulous, try to groom their results to make it seem like they're more successful than they are. And if you think about the current race to develop a COVID vaccine, you can see why this is a problem. Companies loudly proclaiming that they want to be the first to have the vaccine, as if being the first was the most important thing, as opposed to having a vaccine that we knew was safe and worked. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 2. However, it isn't just illness as a general category that has a common plot. There are also lots of recognizably common stories about particular health topics. These stories often include recognizable narrative elements. In order to talk about these narrative elements, I need to introduce you to two terms from literary analysis: genre and trope. So first off, genre. A recognizably common story that shares narrative elements with other stories of its type is called a genre. The reason I almost said species is that genre comes from the Latin word genus, which is the same word in the common binomial nomenclature of taxonomy, genus and species. So, for example, comedy, tragedy, science fiction, romance, and epic fantasy are all genres, and the species of one of those given genres, to give you an example. So Lord of the Rings would be like a species example of epic fantasy, the larger genre or genus. Number 2, trope. A recognizably common element that recurs in a certain type of story or several types of story is called a trope. For example, a trope called The Chosen One describes many sci-fi and fantasy movies. It's the plot in which a quote-unquote normal person realizes they have extraordinary powers and uses them to save the world. And a quick note here, people tend to use the word trope negatively, as if it always means something overplayed to the point of being boring. But tropes can be used well, since they play into audience expectations. Think how unsatisfying a romance would be where the lead couple never got together. So why are genres and tropes important? Well, because they contain a lot of information about what a culture values, and they often also reinforce those values. Genres and tropes, stories and story elements that appear over and over again, tell us something about ourselves. So, for example, one very common media trope is the idea that beautiful people are good people. Think about your favorite TV show or movie. Are all of the heroes hotties, or considered at least conventionally attractive? Yep, I mean, sit there and try to think of an alternate example. It will probably be difficult. This is a trope that goes way, way back in Western history to medieval Christian systems of allegory that considered the outside of a person reflective of their inside. So if you're good on the inside, you look good on the outside. Unfortunately, this obviously ties into a lot of implicit bias. Studies have shown that we are less sympathetic towards less attractive people and much more willing to let pretty people get away with a lot of stuff. This is race and gendered too. Our social standards of attractiveness tend to be white, thin, and young. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 3. So that is the end of the first part of this lecture. Here is your break slide. Please go take a break, get a drink, and then come back to watch the video lecture for part 2.